Let's build a draft board for the Atlanta Falcons for all 7 rounds.
You are Locked On Falcons, your daily Atlanta Falcons podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Welcome back, everyone, to another illustrious episode of the Locked On Falcons podcast, your daily Atlanta Falcons podcast, part of Locked On Sports Atlanta, your team every day. And today's episode is brought to you by Game Time. Download the Game Time app, create an account, and use code LOCKEDONNFL for $20 off your first purchase. So if you do not know me, I'm your very humble host, Aaron Freeman, aka Mr. Drew, aka Sirius Black, aka Mr. aka, and I've been covering the Atlanta Falcons for almost 20 years, formerly at falcfans.com. RIP, still going strong on this illustrious podcast. And I thank each and every one of you that goes strong with me as everydayers. That means you make this podcast your first listen each and every day. And all you have to do to become an everydayer is subscribe or follow for free on YouTube or wherever you listen to podcasts. So today it's all about building a draft board for players that I think are going to be on the Falcons radar on all 3 days of the draft. For those of you checking us out on YouTube, you can check out the graphics, but we'll do our best to describe it for all of you everydayers that are on the audio side of things. But there's been a lot of 7-round mock drafts going around the last 24 hours. Dane Brugler over at The Athletic dropped one. Torrey McElhaney, Taryn Wack dropped theirs at AtlantaFalcons.com. So I figured I add my 2 cents, critique some of these things, talk about some of these players that they have selecting for the Atlanta Falcons, as well as sort of building my own sort of draft board in terms of expectations for players in round 1. And let's start with round 1, right? I only have a couple of names on this list of guys that I think are legitimate targets for the Atlanta Falcons. Of course, history tells us that what you think is going to happen in round 1 for the Atlanta Falcons is probably not going to happen. Although, really, outside of the Michael Penix pick, Terry Fontenot's drafts have been more chalky than historically with the Falcons. But maybe we're back to the Dimitroff era where it's just like you never know what the Falcons are going to do in round 1. But for me, I sort of see 2 options for the Falcons in round 1. Obviously, stick in pick at pick 15 and take the best edge rusher available, or trade back. And I think that opens the door for the Falcons to go in a different direction than the edge rusher. I still think there may be options depending on how far they move back. But as I discussed last week with Jarvis Davis of Locked On Sports Atlanta, because you have teams like Arizona, Cincinnati, and Tampa Bay, all of whom are in the market for pass rushers and edge rushers specifically, I don't know if the Falcons can feel as comfortable moving back, more than more than really any spots, and still be able to get an edge rusher that they're looking for. So we'll have to sort of see on that front. But for the 3 guys that I think are likely or potential options for the Falcons, if they stick and pick at 15, it's Donovan Ezeraku of Boston College, Mike Green of Marshall, and Jalon Walker of Georgia. Now, the expectation is that Jalon Walker is going to be a top 10 pick. He has been consistently mocked to the Carolina Panthers at pick 8. But in a world where the Panthers pass on him and Jalon Walker starts to slide, I could imagine the Falcons, sprinting to the podium and taking Jalon Walker with his A-plus character and his, defensive scheme versatility. Now, I'm not the world's biggest fan of Jalon Walker. I'll just admit that up front to you guys. We talked about this on a Mock Draft Monday a couple of weeks ago, where I feel like Jalon Walker is the type of player that I would not feel great about the Falcons drafting, just because I don't know he'll get the stability here in Atlanta in terms of being able to play one spot and being able to comfortably have that runway to develop at that one spot, because I do think Jalon Walker is much more of a project than a immediate impact player, but we'll have to sort of see on that front. But, I think it's interesting. Dane Brugler did have Mike Green as the Falcons pick at pick 15 in his mock draft. Taryn Wack had Donovan Ezeraku as the pick at 15. And interesting, Torrey McElhaney had the Falcons trading back and getting Mykel Williams out of Georgia at pick 22, trading with the LA Chargers. And to me, Mykel Williams is one of 5 guys that I think are legitimate options for the Falcons should they move back, right? He's the lone edge rusher that I feel like could slide in this draft. We'll see on that front. Dane Brugler had Michael going 16 to the Arizona Cardinals. We'll have to sort of see on that one. But in addition to Michael Williams, Kenneth Grant, the D tackle out of Michigan, Jahdae Barron, the cornerback out of Texas, Will Johnson, the cornerback out of Michigan, and Malachi Starks, the safety out of Georgia, to me are the prime sort of guys that if the Falcons do move back, it becomes much more apparent and potentially probable that the Falcons could take a non-edge rusher at those picks. For those that didn't see Dane's mock draft, again, he had Williams at 16. He had Kenneth Grant going to the Chargers at 22. He had Will Johnson going 23. He had Jahdae Barron going 24 and Malachi Starks going 30. And I feel like that range is right for those guys. Williams is the kind of the wild card for me. In terms of like, I could see him going 11 to the 49ers. I could see him going like 28 or something, wherever the Lions are picking at the back end of round one. So he's a bit more of a wild card. And it's interesting to see Dane projecting Barron and Johnson to go where they're going, because I have seen a lot of mock drafts over the last couple of months that have both of those guys, going in the top, 10, if not 15 picks in the draft. And so I feel like that's the right spots for those guys in terms of what they are as prospects, but that's just my personal opinion. And as you guys well know, as I talked about back in February, Malachi Starks to me is a late first round pick in that regard. So pick 30 is about right where I feel like where he should go. So we'll see if the Falcons stick and pick at 15 and or move back in the draft. Again, I think the general consensus is there's been a big groundswell for Mike Green being the pick at 15 over the last couple of weeks, basically since the end of March. And because everybody seems to be convinced that Mike Green is going to be the pick, the Falcons will pick him and they'll wind up taking like Ezra Rocco or something like that. So we'll see on that front, but we will, even though we know for a fact that edge rusher is going to be the Falcons' first round pick, let's talk about some day two options in terms of edge rushers, along with some run pluggers and some defensive backs that the Falcons could find on their draft board on day two as we continue today's Locked On Falcons. So we know there's nothing like that atmosphere in an NBA playoff game. And this Friday at State Farm Arena, we know the Atlanta Hawks, that place is going to be jumping as we prep for whoever they wind up playing. As I record this, we don't know who that game is going to be, but I'm sure some of you guys are worried about, how do I get tickets? Well, you don't have to worry about that, because Game Time is taking the guesswork out of buying tickets, especially taking the stress out of buying last minute tickets. Game Times make it fast and easy to get those playoff tickets, even when the demand is sky high. Prices on the app actually go down as we get closer to tip off, and those last minute deals can save you up to 60%. And so that's not just for playoff games, whether it's other sports, concerts, comedy, music, theater, whatever event is near you, you can save up to 60% on those last minute deals. And, make sure you take the guesswork out of buying tickets with Game Time and download the Game Time app, create an account, and use code LOCKEDONNFL for $20 off your first purchase. Terms apply. Again, create an account and redeem code LOCKEDONNFL for $20 off. Download Game Time today. Last minute tickets, lowest price guaranteed. So as we look ahead to day two, I have several more candidates in terms of not only second round guys, but in the event that the Falcons should move back in round one and potentially pick up a third round pick. I think it's more likely that they'll be able to pick up a third round pick than an extra second round pick in a trade back. Just because I'm not expecting the Falcons to go back super far. Like I think they would have to go back 8 to 10 spots to get a second. But if they only go back like 2 or 3 spots, or really 5 spots, I think you need to get 5 spots to get a third round pick. But we'll see on that front. But I do have some options for mostly defensive players on day two, both in the second round and as well third round if they pick up a pick. Despite talking yesterday extensively about some round 2 offensive tackles that the Falcons may take, I do not have any round 2 tackles on this draft board. I do have some from round 3, but again, I don't think the Falcons are going to prioritize that offensive tackle position at the top of their draft. I think if they do take an offensive player, it'll wait till day 3 of this draft. And so day 1s and day 2 will be devoted to defensive players. However, in a world where they do get that trade back, I think it does become more plausible that they could take an offensive tackle in round 3. And the 3 I list as round 3 targets are Anthony Belton out of NC State, Charles Grant out of William and Mary, and Ozzie Trapilo out of Boston College. And even though we know that the Atlanta Falcons are definitely 100% going to take an edge rusher in round 1, just in case, something crazy happens, the Falcons zig when we expect them to zag. I do have a couple of edge rushers available in rounds 2 and 3. Round 2, I list Landon Jackson out of Arkansas and Nick Scorton out of Texas A&M, although I think I realize on this graphic I have him at Purdue. That was his old school before he transferred to Texas A&M this past year. In round 3, I have Oluwafemi Oladejo, the edge rusher from UCLA, Josiah Stewart from Michigan, and David Walker of Central Arkansas. And as we discussed last week on the podcast, the tendency for the Falcons trends when it comes to drafting edge rushers or guys that are productive. Now, not all these guys, all 6 or 5 of these guys that I list were super productive in college. Like Landon Jackson didn't have a great senior year, and Oladejo just made the transition to edge rusher. And, I would argue, I know this is going to be a spicy take to a lot of people, I think he's just as good a prospect, if arguably a better prospect, than Jalon Walker. That's just my personal opinion. But, maybe that's not true, but to me, they're in a similar tier is basically what I would say in terms of what they're bringing to the table. But, it's interesting that Taron Wack had Oladejo as the Falcons pick in round 4. But, Scorton was super productive as a junior at Purdue. That's why I had Purdue on the mind. And Walker and Stewart were also very productive these past couple of years, even Walker at a small school. Stewart, I think, had the highest win rate of any pass rusher in college and just bombed his 40 at the pro day earlier this week with Will Johnson. I think he ran like a 4.8, something like that. So he may be sliding in the draft, and maybe he'll slide all the way to day 3 or whatever, but we'll see on that front. But, I do think if I was to guess right now what I would project the Falcons to take on round 2, I would expect them to take a D tackle. Now, I personally think they should take a corner, right? That's, to me, where the value is. That's where the upside is. But knowing the Falcons, they're going to sit here and they're going to be like, we're all about our front. And then they're going to take a 2-down run plugger at that nose tackle position in round 2 at pick 46. And the 2 guys I have listed as potential targets are Alfred Collins out of Texas and Tyleik Williams out of Ohio State. I would guess that if the Falcons had the choice between those 2 guys, they would probably prefer Collins. Just because he has a little bit more length. And I think you can argue that Collins may be the best, run defender in the entire draft class. He's arguably even a better run defender than Kenneth Grant, who's projected to go in round 1. And now the knock on Collins is he has 0 upside, if you ask me, as a pass rusher. And I think that's the general consensus. Maybe other people are like, he's a 2 out of 10 in terms of upside as a pass rusher instead of a 0. And that's the main difference in why Kenneth Grant is going to be a first-round pick, because he does have a lot more upside as a pass rusher than Collins does. But, and again, that's part of the reason why I value the quarterback a little bit more than the run plugger, as good as Collins is, just because, if I'm going to get if I'm only going to get a guy that's going to be effective on 2 downs, and I'll wait till day 3, round 4 to get that guy. And we'll talk about some of the guys that I have on my radar as far as round 4 goes. But the last couple of days on the pod, we've talked about 6 different DBs or 6 different cornerbacks that could be targets for the Falcons in round 2. 4 of those guys appear on this list. No Benjamin Morrison out of Notre Dame and no Savone Ravel out of ECU. I believe Taron had Ravel as the pick. I'd personally be probably happiest among the cornerbacks with Ravel. I just feel like he probably has the most traits and upside of that group of individuals that we talked about over the last couple of days. But for the other 4 guys that we talked about Trey Amos of Ole Miss, Maxwell Hairston of Kentucky, and Azareye'h Thomas out of Florida State. I have all 3 of those guys listed as second-round targets. The 6th guy was Darian Porter of Iowa State. I have him in round 3. I also have Jacob Parrish out of Kansas State in round 3 and Quincy Riley out of Louisville in round 3. Porter is an outside guy. Parrish and Riley, I think, would most likely project as nickel corners if the Falcons were to draft him. I'm a big fan of Jacob Parrish. I'll say that. I feel like he's he's not Brent Grimes, but like he's more Brent Grimes than certainly I think Clark Phillips is, who also got some Brent Grimes comparisons when we drafted him. But I feel like Parrish is a better bet to be Grimes like, but probably more as a nickel than an outside corner like Brent Grimes was. But those are sort of the cornerbacks that I would love to see the Falcons draft at this point. Trying to look at, Tori had Amos as her round 2 pick and also had Xavier Watts, the safety out of Notre Dame, as a round 2 selection with the second round pick that she got in her mock trading back with the Chargers. And so I think Xavier Watts is if the Falcons are going to go with a safety early, Xavier Watts makes a ton of sense based off of his ball production and whatnot. I haven't done a deep dive on his film, but just seen enough that I think he'll probably be the third safety off the board after Starks and Nick Emanwori out of South Carolina. But I do have a couple of third round safeties like Billy Bowman Jr. out of Oklahoma, Andrew Makuba, the safety out of Texas, as potential options for the Falcons as well, should they pick up a third round pick. So let's, talk a little bit more about those day 3 options. Beyond this, we'll talk a little bit more about the offensive line. We'll talk about some of those nose tackles that could be available, and we'll talk about a Devin Witherspoon light that could be a day 3 option as we wrap up today's Locked On Falcons. So as a small business owner, your work doesn't end when the clock hits 5. Your business is always on your mind, which means when it's time to hire, you need a partner that works just as hard as you do, and that's where LinkedIn Jobs comes in. When you clock out, LinkedIn is going to clock in. LinkedIn's going to make it easy to post your job for free and share it with your network and get qualified candidates all in one place. And when you post your job, LinkedIn has a new feature that's going to help you write job descriptions and then quickly get your job in front of the right people with deep candidate insights. And here's a pro tip: when you add the hashtag hiring frame to your profile picture it will double your reach to qualified candidates. No wonder why 72% of small businesses say LinkedIn helps them find high quality hires. Post your job for free at linkedin.com/lockedonnfl. That's linkedin.com/lockedonnfl to post your job for free. Terms and conditions apply. So, let's get into these day 3 candidates. And rather than going, I don't have any 5th or 6th round guys because, again, that's just would have involved way too much work. So we're just going to focus on round 4 guys and round 7 guys because those are the picks the Falcons currently have. And obviously, if they do wind up trading back, particularly on day 2 of the draft, they're more likely to pick up to some of those day 3 picks, right? If you're going to trade back in round 1, it's likely you're going to net either a 2nd or 3rd round pick, depending on how far you go back. If you trade back in round 2, it's likely that you'll be able to net a 4th or 5th round pick, depending on how far you go back and vice versa and all that stuff. So, we'll see how the Falcons manipulate their board again. At some point, I do expect them to trade back. More likely, I think it's likely to be on day 2 than it is on day 1 of the draft, but we'll see. And as I mentioned earlier, I feel like if the Falcons are going to go offense in this draft and not make it a completely defensive draft, it'll most likely happen on day 3 of the draft. And so you probably noticed that I didn't have a center on my day 2 draft board. And I'm not convinced the Falcons are going to draft a center. However, I do think if I was a betting man, I think it's more likely that the Falcons will draft a center than they draft an offensive tackle this year. That's just my personal opinion. And the centers I have listed here in round 4, I have Seth McLaughlin of Ohio State and Jake Majors out of Texas. And then in round 7, I have Eli Cox of Kentucky, Drew Kendall of Boston College, and Thomas Perry, the Division III superstar from Middlebury. And you probably wonder, okay, why did you have these guys listed over, say, a Jared Wilson, who's projected to be a day 2 selection, the Georgia center? And mostly, with the exception of Perry, all of these guys have 3 or more years of starting experience in college. And when you look at the centers that are able to come in and impact right away in the league, and I think we discussed this on the podcast previously, the one commonality that they all have is that they had 3 or more years of starting center experience in college. Wilson only has 1 year of starting experience. So it's very unlikely based off of that. And again, Wilson could be the exception to the rule. There's no rule that says, oh, if you only start this many years, you can't be an impact rookie. But when we're talking about guys that have the potential to come in and really push Ryan Nuzul, which is what you want if you're going to expend a draft pick on a center in this year's draft, rather than what we've talked about before, where you draft a center with the idea that, oh, he's going to be a redshirt guy, and then he's going to start for you in 2026. Like, you can't count on that, because there could be a brand new coaching staff. And as we discussed before on the podcast, there's a tendency when you have a brand new coaching staff, and again, we'll see what happens this season with the Falcons and Raheem Morris and Terry Fontenot. But when you bring in a brand new regime, oftentimes one of the positions that changes is the center position. And so there's no guarantee that whoever you draft this year at center is locked in to be the starting center beyond this season. So if you want to get a guy that's going to be able to impact right away, and hopefully that's the goal of the Falcons, rather than a developmental center. Again, nothing wrong with a developmental center, but that's not something that I think should be a priority for this team, given all their needs elsewhere. That's a player that has that experience. And so notably, Dane Brugler had Jared Wilson going 69 in his seven-round mock. Nice. He had Seth McLaughlin going 169. Nice. He had Drew Kindle 191, Eli Cox 241, and he did not have Jake Majors or Thomas Perry coming off the board in his mock draft. So apparently priority free agents in his regard. Taryn Wack had Seth McLaughlin as her round 4 pick. Tori McElhaney had Drew Kindle as her round 4 pick. So obviously where these centers sort of stack, we'll have to sort of see some disagreement. Like I have Majors in round 4, and Tori has Kindle in round 4. I have Kindle in round 7. Dane Brugler has Majors going undrafted. So we'll sort of have to see how the board sort of falls on that one. But Perry I included just as sort of as a outlier, just because by all accounts he was dominant at the Shrine Bowl. He played predominantly guard in college, but apparently killed it during the Shrine Bowl practices at center that week. And essentially, is kind of a poor man's Quinn Miners. And hopefully the Falcons learned a lesson from 3 years ago when they drafted Jalen Mayfield over Quinn Miners. And now Quinn Miners is one of the higher paid guards in the NFL. And I think, did he make an All-Pro last year or a Pro Bowl last year? I can't remember, but he got he got a big contract. I know that. So even if he didn't get honored with it, he earned that contract. And meanwhile, Jalen Mayfield's out of the league. But as far as offensive tackles go, I have a couple in round 4. Logan Brown out of Kansas, Chase Lunt out of Connecticut. Dane actually had Dane Brugler, that is, had Brown as the Falcons pick in round 4 in his 7-round mock. He also had Lunt going about 6 picks earlier to the Saints in his 7-round mock in round 4. And then in round 7, the offensive tackle targets I have are Carson Vincent out of Alabama A&M and Branson Taylor, the legendary tackle from Pitt. And the only reason I include Branson Taylor, because I was looking at some recruiting websites from back in the day when what's his name? Dwayne Lifford. I blanked on his name. Dwayne Lifford, the Falcons offensive line coach, was at Louisville. So I looked at some of the guys that they were trying to recruit at Louisville, and Branson Taylor, I think Seth McLaughlin was also on that list as well. I have to go double check. But there was a couple of guys that are draft eligible on the offensive line that they tried to recruit. And it's notable to me because the Falcons signed Brandon Parker last summer, who Dwayne Lifford tried to recruit to NC State when he was the O-line coach there. And they also drafted Javon Gwynn 2 years ago when Dwayne Lifford tried to recruit him to NC State when he was the O-line coach there. And so that's just something to keep an eye on. So Branson Taylor was just, okay, let me throw the pick guy in there. Got to give my pick guy some love. Another pick guy I give some love is Gavin Bartholomew, the tight end out of Pittsburgh, as a round 7 option. Just because he has special teams background. So does the other tight ends I mentioned. CJ Dupree out of Alabama, Luke Lachey out of Iowa have all special teams background. And if those guys are going to come in as number 3 tight ends, having that special teams background is going to help them make the roster. Ben Urasek, the Georgia tight end, a former Stanford tight end, doesn't have a special teams background or really much of a special teams background like the rest of these guys do. But, just throw him out because we know we got to get a late round Georgia guy in this draft. So, if we're looking on the defensive side of the ball, where I do think if I was running the Falcons draft board, I'd be targeting that nose tackle in round 4, where you feel a little less bad about taking a 2-down player, particularly for a team like the Falcons who have no pass rush. for me. But obviously, as I mentioned earlier, I do feel like the Falcons are more inclined to take that nose tackle earlier in the draft in round 2. But for me, if I have my druthers, I'm taking that corner in round 2. I'm taking the D tackle in round 4, and I have Jamari Caldwell of Oregon, Cam Jackson of Florida, Jordan Phillips of Maryland, and CJ West of Indiana as the round 4 targets at that nose tackle spot. Dane Brugler had all those guys going between 99 and 123. So late third, early mid fourth round range for those guys. And so again, that's where I think the sweet spot is for the Falcons. One of those guys should be there for them in round 4. If they don't get that guy in round 4, they still have some options for some 2-down guys. Nazir Stackhouse out of Georgia, Zeke Biggers out of Georgia Tech. I think will potentially be there in round 7. I think Dane had a Stackhouse going off the board at 196, so somewhere in like round 6 or so. And Biggers he had undrafted in this draft class, but 2 local guys, Georgia and Georgia Tech. In terms of, we know the Falcons got to get their late 7 round guys. And the last little tidbit, in the event that the Falcons do what I think they're going to do and take a run plugger in round 2 and not take the corner until day 3, assuming that they don't trade back and get a 3rd round pick at some point. But if they do wait, if we're sitting there around 4 waiting for that corner, the guy that I think the circle, I listed a couple of guys, but the one guy that I would circle and underline is Cobee Bryant out of Kansas. The Black Mamba out of Kansas. And I think I mentioned on Locked On Falcons Insiders that I'll be doing a film breakdown of the 6 corners I talked about yesterday, as well as I think Jacob Parrish and I said Quincy Wiley, and I meant Cobee Bryant. And I think the thing about Cobee Bryant is if you were a big fan of Devin Witherspoon, if you wanted the Falcons to take him at the top of the 23 draft instead of Bijan Robinson, obviously he went off the board number 5 to the Seahawks. That basically Cobee Bryant is a poor man's version of Devin Witherspoon. He's got that dog in him. And Dane Brugler had Bryant as the Falcons' 7th round pick in his 7-round mock draft with the earlier picks at 218. But I'm expecting Cobee Bryant to go off the board a little earlier than that. He was another guy that stood out at the Shrine Bowl. And by some accounts, again, I wasn't there, but by some accounts, he was like the best player at the Shrine Bowl during that week. So he's a guy that I would definitely keep an eye on when it comes to that. So if I'm sitting here doing my own 7-round mock draft without any trades or anything like that, just with the picks that the Falcons have, I would sit here and probably say round 1, the player I would like the team to probably take is Mike Green out of Marshall. But knowing the Falcons, they'll zig when we sector to zag. Everybody, as I said, everybody's like sort of locked in on Mike Green being the pick, and so they'll take Ezra Raku, the edge rusher out of Boston College with that 1st round pick, just to be different. And then in round 2, get Alfred Collins, the D tackle, nose tackle out of Texas. And then round 4, I'll project Cobee Bryant as the 4th round selection. And then in round 7, we'll have them take their center and Eli Cox out of Kentucky. And then, of course, we got to get our Georgia guy in round 7. And that, of course, we got to get a safety, right? Dan Jackson out of Georgia to come in and play special teams and just be a thumper on special teams. And so like that would be, if I was projecting the 7 rounds right now, as Araku, Collins, Bryant, Cox, and Jackson as the Falcons' 5 picks with the picks that they currently have. But hopefully we'll see the Falcons manipulate the draft board, and we'll be sitting here and I'll be sitting here saying, oh yeah, that was a guy that I had circled as a round 5, round 6 option for the Falcons if I had expanded that, on this episode. But because I didn't want to, there's only so many graphics you guys can expect me to do. So that's why we didn't go dive in too deep into, round 5, round 6 options in the event of a trade back. So there you guys have it. We will be back tomorrow with Jarvis Davis of Locked On Sports Atlanta to talk about whatever we're going to talk about. You guys know Jarvis and I will go off the deep end sometimes. Usually I'm just like, okay, 30 minutes before I sit down and record with Jarvis, so let me come up with some topics that we can talk about. So it's rarely premeditated. No, what's the word? Premeditated. That's the word. Boy, premedicated. Yeah, that's probably an accurate description of the conversations Jarvis and I have. So if you want to get your premedicated podcast tomorrow, check out Locked On Falcons. Of course, you can subscribe and follow for free on YouTube or wherever you listen to podcasts. And for your second listen, check out the Locked On NFL Draft podcast. Keith Sanchez, Damian Parson, talking about all the various prospects from rounds 1 through 7 every day, all day. It's all part of Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Oh yeah, and if you're checking us out on YouTube, leave a comment on some of the guys that you think I missed on this draft board, some of these guys that you like, some of the guys you don't like, all that and more. So, always leave a comment.